So, Robert Hill, thanks for joining us on Lessons on Leadership.
Pleasure.
Tell us how you became Defence Minister.
Well, I'd had 6 years as Environment Minister, and I thought that the portfolio might benefit from having someone else for a while. You can sort of get a bit too familiar over time, and then we had an election, and it was what I was going to do after the election. And I had some discussions with the Prime Minister, John Howard, about what I might like to do. And out of that, I became Defence Minister.
And what appealed to you about the portfolio, looking at it from the outside at this stage?
Well, much of my professional background had been in foreign relations. And as you might remember, I was for many years, I think some 4 years, Shadow Foreign Minister. And for a year I was Shadow Defence Minister. So I'd always been around the debate, international relations debate, relationship between states, from a security perspective and other perspectives as well. So it was familiar territory to me. It was an area in which I had an interest. It's an area I thought from my background I might have something to offer.
One question I've asked all the ministers I've spoken to was, did they get a handover from the preceding minister? Did that happen in your case?
I wouldn't say a handover. You don't normally get handovers in politics.
Straight into the deep end.
If once you're gone, you're gone. But Peter Reith was my predecessor, so he went retired at that election. And I had a chat with him about some of the outstanding issues. He had outstanding, in a sense, of unsettled issues. You might remember one concerned the so-called children overboard affair. I just wanted to better understand his perspective of that issue. I can remember that. But not really much more than that.
I think for most of your Defence Minister colleagues, it was straight into the deep end without anything really, maybe just a quick chat, but that seemed to be the common experience.
Yeah, but I was pretty familiar with the business of defence. I've visited so many of the bases, met a lot of the senior people over the years, and I'd been obviously in the cabinet already for 6 years. I was in the leadership group. All the major security decisions that had been made in the previous 6 years I'd been party to. Some of them directly engaged in those decisions, so it wasn't as if I was getting into unfamiliar territory.
Yes. So, Robert, did you have an agenda, a list of things that you wanted to do when you took the portfolio?
No, not as such. It's an interesting contrast coming from environment. Environment was a different challenge entirely. New laws were still developing, and you were supposed to lead in the development of that. A bureaucracy that was still uncertain of their role. New cultures were being developed. It was very much you were integral to the growth of the environment portfolio itself. You know, new portfolios all over the world. There hasn't been a history of environment portfolios. The issues were growing issues, and therefore countries were starting to find ways to adapt. Defence, of course, so confident in itself, existed historically forever. Doctrine well settled. Chains of command understood. So it's a different role entirely from the minister. You almost sort of slot into the way it's always been done.
Yes.
But I knew that I would be, wrestling with the issues of acquisitions because it had always been a challenge. I knew that I'd be facing up to some pretty serious operational issues because we had already committed to Afghanistan, and I think my attitude was just to, from a governance perspective, try to ensure the portfolio ran well during my tenure.
Of course, defence has a notoriously strong culture, or perhaps cultures is the better way to put it, the tribes of the Defence Force and then the civilians as well. What was your experience of dealing with that? I mean, the first thing the Minister has to do is really establish a relationship with the Secretary and the CDF.
Right.
So how did you go about that?
The worst thing I could do would be to disrupt their culture. But I had a different culture. I had a political culture. Mine was a political office. You know, I was in effect the interface between the department and the people in some ways. You know, responsibility under the Defence Act and obviously responsibilities within Cabinet and the National Security Committee of Cabinet. So I saw myself as a different layer, and bringing with it a different culture. So it was really how the two cultures could work together. And as you're hinting at, the relationship with people is critically important in that regard. So during my time, I had 3 CDFs. I had about 6 months of Admiral Barry. So, and I got on fine with all of them, but he had a particular style, a naval background, that brings a slightly different perspective, but he was also locked up in some of those controversies. So I had to manage, because the controversies were political, I had to manage that, and in some ways more than he had to. And then the issue of the secretary, I had a change of secretary. So when the vacancy occurred, I knew what I wanted from a secretary of the department. I think it's a critically important job and a very difficult job, the hardest job actually. And I knew the sort of person I was looking for, and I went out searching for that person. And I believed I found him in Rick Smith, but of course he was a diplomat. He was then serving in Indonesia. And I said to the Prime Minister, I reckon Smith would be the right person for this job. So what are the qualities? You know, experience, a confident, smart, able to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder to the CDF, mutual respect, those sort of things. And Howard said, well, if that's what you think, give him a try. So I rang Smith in Indonesia, Jakarta, said, would you do this? Thought about it for a few minutes and said yes. So I had him then for the rest of my term. So I had a good secretary. And then most of my term I had Peter Cosgrove. Of course, he'd already established himself as a national hero. So he was Chief of Army, and we promoted him to CDF. He was an obvious choice for CDF. But he was always hugely respectful of the civilian oversight, the civilian governance, so that relationship worked well. And when he finally retired, I got Angus Houston, or we appointed Angus Houston, who was also pretty logically the next CDF, but with an Air Force background, different personality, different sort of person. But that worked well. So if I had the right people at the senior levels of both the civilian side and the military side, I always believed we could manage the different cultures.
What's your thinking about the leadership role that a minister has to play in an organisation as sort of internally coherent and powerful as Defence? How does leadership play out in that context for a minister?
So you've got to make it work. There's got to be mutual respect, and not just of the individuals, more so of the roles, of the responsibilities. I had a set of responsibilities which I loosely refer to as governance, and they had a set of responsibilities either of command or, in the case of the secretary, administrative leadership within the department. And provided we understood that, I found that it could be made to work quite effectively. So, for example, I would never interfere in the chain of command in the military, and I've sometimes seen it happen that if there's been a problem, there's been a temptation of the political side to blame an individual lower down in the chain of command. I always believe that would be hugely disruptive. You expect someone higher in the chain to deal with that problem, and then if that doesn't occur, then you deal with the person higher in the chain of command. So as long as you respect those different cultures, then I think it can be made to work effectively.
Another sort of generic question I have for you is about workload. It's become very clear talking to other ministers that defence was an intensely high workload experience for them, and the department does have the capacity to rather overwhelm ministers with paperwork. What was your work regime? How did you sort of handle the workload? I mean, you're also leader of the government in the Senate, which had its own workload at the same time. So.
Yeah. So I had a big workload, and I basically worked at it 7 days a week. But part of it was self-inflicted. One of the things I was criticised for from time to time was perhaps being a little too hands-on, a little bit too micro-managing. I would never say micromanaging, but in politics, it tends to be the small things that cause you the biggest headaches, and therefore I tended to want to watch out for those small things. And I had spent a lot of time on a lot of the acquisition stuff where there were historical issues, trying to go back through the history of a failed acquisition or a failing acquisition, why it's occurring, now it's got to this point, what are the options, what's the best way forward. And these briefs, needless to say, were all this thick. And I had a practice in the office. I might have advisors, and I didn't bring departmental people in as advisors. I think, again, mine's a political office. If I wanted the departmental advice, I get it across the other side of the lake. So they may help me by going through that brief first and giving me their views, but then I'd tend to do it again myself.
Right.
To be absolutely satisfied that we were making the right decision. So some of the workload was self-inflicted. You can do it with a lesser workload if that's the way you do things.
So you became minister about a month after the attack in the United States of Al-Qaeda on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And John Howard, within days of that attack, had invoked the ANZUS Treaty. And Australia effectively looked as though it was on the pathway to war. What was your reflections on that time, and what did you conceive to be the task that was likely to be ahead of us at that stage?
I was, the attack on the Twin Towers, I was actually Environment Minister, and I was in the Northern Territory. I was in Kakadu National Park for some meetings. It was surreal that I was in this blissful environment and these terrible things were happening. But like everyone else, I think I got drawn to the television in this sort of sense of disbelief. And we had, and as you said, John Howard was away, but we had a meeting of, it was the National Security Committee. No, it wouldn't have been. That must have been the leadership group. Mm-hmm. The following morning, I was doing it by a telephone, handheld phone. By then, I'd moved on to Elcho Island. And it was a lot about what on earth is happening, because we didn't know, what the next step in this would be. Were we about to be attacked, or what was going on? So we took advice from senior military, from the senior police, and those sort of things. And then it evolved from there. So then, in the middle of all this, I switched portfolios to defence. And by the time I took up the defence portfolio, we'd actually made a decision to participate in the Afghanistan operation, but we hadn't actually deployed forces at that time. So my first real engagement was the deployment of forces. So before that, when John Howard got back from America, as a cabinet, we confirmed that the ANZUS decision, and then it was implementing basically the decision that had already been made in relation to participation in the operation. So I'd been, as far as Australia was concerned, I'd sort of been around the issues since the attack on the Twin Towers, so there was no surprises to me in that regard. I remember I went to Western Australia and addressed the Special Forces before they left, which was, I think some of the military wondered whether it was really an appropriate thing for a minister to do. But I had a view that when we had made a decision to deploy them, they had a right to hear from me the basis for that, what it was our rationale, what we as a government were expecting of them. And they seemed to appreciate it, and I did that a number of times over the years, and it seemed to be well received, whatever the command thought of it. And I used to often meet them and their families when they came back too, and the families seemed to appreciate that. So it was just one way of doing the business, I suppose. But so Afghanistan was then on, and of course later on we had Iraq as well, but that was a different set of circumstances. There was no going into Afghanistan was not controversial.
No.
The Security Council had backed it. The regime had clearly supported those who had carried out the attack, and it was accepted as a legitimate response. So
Australia had also a relatively discreet, carefully defined mission in the early stages of that operation in 2001, I'm talking about, and 2002. But as 2002 moved on, it became pretty clear, I think, to all of us that the United States was positioning itself for potentially an attack on Iraq, which in some ways George W. Bush, I think, saw as unfinished business from the time of his father as president, from the first Iraq War of a decade or so earlier. What's your thinking about Australia's strategic options and choices as we got closer and closer to that attack on Iraq, which was March of 2003, and it seemed pretty clear from the get-go that Australia was in some way going to be a part of this overall operation?
So I was deeply involved in that from the very start. From when it appeared that the US might conduct operations in Iraq, we put defence people into the commands in the United States for the reason to better understand what they were doing, because we didn't want to be blindsided. I thought that was a cautious but sensible preparation. We were still wrestling with the basis for any possible operation, and I don't know about unfinished, but that's business. I can't get into the mind of the George W. Bush, but the public rationale, which I accepted, was an issue about weapons of mass destruction. The UN and the Security Council were going through a rather tortuous process on that, and there'd been the various missions of inquiry conducted, and the results of those were somewhat ambiguous. And as the months went by, it became apparent that the Security Council was not really going to resolve the matter. So we had a situation where we believed Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons and biological weapons. I was briefed accordingly by Defence. I was briefed in such detail that they even informed me of the command under which those weapons would be used by the Iraqis. Those briefs are also given to the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And there was the fear Saddam had formed, of course. We'd been to Iraq before. He'd invaded Kuwait, so he was a person we understood with these weapons, these illegal weapon systems, and he was a person with expansionist goals. A person who was even been prepared to use those weapons on his own people. So, being dissatisfied not being satisfied that he was prepared to relinquish them as demanded by the world, but that he still retained those weapons, was a risk we had to evaluate. History showed that when he deployed, we tended to get drawn into the conflict. So we're facing the potential of being drawn into a second conflict in Iraq with him with weapons of mass destruction. And the question was whether to join an American operation to remove that risk, to remove that threat, or not. And we decided we should do so.
Was it ever really a case of that being a tough decision, or was it something that seemed pretty obvious from the perspective of the alliance relationship, the weapons of mass destruction perception that we had at the time? Could Cabinet have made a decision different to the one it did and not go in?
So I guess there are two issues. Even if you decide the threat is there, you can still decide not to deploy. Would take the risk,
yes.
you know.
As the French did.
As the French did. And also, of course, there is the relationship with the United States. If you're going to be in alliance with the United States in the way that we are, and the US asks for your support, it's actually a pretty hard decision to say no, because no doubt there will be another occasion when you'll be asking them for support. That's the nature of alliances. You've got to be. We could still say no, but it would have been quite a big decision to say no. Mm. So that combination of the US asking us to join them in what they saw was a serious operation to remove this threat, and us accepting that the threat was a reality, led us to the conclusion that we did.
What was your reaction to the, I guess, fairly rapidly emerging reality that in fact that there was no active weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq beyond some mustard gas, and that the fear of chemical and biological, let alone nuclear weapons,
we didn't ever say that at that time he had nuclear weapons. Yes. There were some others around the world who did, yes. But our intelligence was chemical and biological. Well, I was surprised because I'd even had the anthrax vaccination because I couldn't go to
right.
Defence was so confident that I wouldn't be allowed to go to Iraq without being vaccinated first against right. anthrax.
Okay.
And I'm not keen on the jab unless it's necessary. So I was surprised, but. I think it's pretty clear now what happened was, and that was basically that he did comply with the Security Council orders, but that he didn't want to disclose that he complied because that would portray a weakness in his domestic environment. He ran that country through an environment of fear. So if you look as if you're being pushed around, it's not good for your future. So he deceived his own people on that, and he deceived the global community on that. But you can't make decisions with the benefit of hindsight. I believe the decision we made at the time was the right decision, the right circumstances on the information that we had.
So my recollection of the approach of Australia's involvement in the early stages of the war was that, again, a fairly discrete set of objectives had been defined for the ADF. And about 120 or so days in, we'd more or less achieved everything that the Prime Minister had said was the purpose of Australia's mission. And effectively, we could start to bring those forces home. The next thing that happens, I'm leaping forward a year or two here, is the government takes a decision to effectively go back in, this time to Al Mathana province down in the south of Iraq, to support a contingent of Japanese Self-Defence Force engineers, which was deploying in, and we were going to provide them with that force protection. So can you take us through the Cabinet thinking about that second decision to sort of double down on what, for Australia at least, had been a reasonably successful first mission into Iraq?
So it sort of happened with Afghanistan as well, slightly differently. And this is one of the big challenges with operation we've found. So far on, and we've still got Americans are still in Afghanistan and still in Iraq, and I remember Iraq. I remember going to Iraq shortly after the invasion and meeting the senior American. I was a civilian, and he said to me, "My instructions are we're out of here after 60 days. We'll be out of Iraq after 60 days." And it all changed in the 60 days, and they're still there.
Yeah.
Because once you, if you take Iraq, even in international law, once you occupy a place, then you have a responsibility for it. You have responsibility for its peace and security and all of those things. So you are locked in, and then your definition of what you're seeking to achieve whilst you're there changes as well. Mm. And in the case of Iraq, it is the case that I think they called it the Phase 4, the so-called Phase 4, that what was going to happen after the invasion was really underdeveloped.
Yes.
Department of State was still arguing with the Pentagon. Pentagon, like all militaries, think they can do more than they can really do. So it was what they were going to do was continually evolving and is still evolving today. And we went through all those years of working with them on what sort of government they might have, how to structure the country. And in many ways, we didn't really understand the country, the cultures, the tribalism at all, or not much. And I think the lesson is that the defence really is a blunt instrument. There are some roles that defence can carry out very efficiently and effectively, and they did it at the beginning of Afghanistan, and they did it extraordinarily effectively at the beginning of Iraq, but after that it becomes more complicated. And it was why in Afghanistan, I was keen to transition to what we were calling provincial reconstruction roles, because I knew that unless you help them rebuild the country, which is really education, health and all those things, you would never have a stable environment. Mm. But there was always the security threat at the background, so you tended to be trying to conduct two different missions at the one time. People who you'd send in for health and education had to be protected, and then you're still in the conflicts. And as you say, in Iraq, our people did well, rebuilding bridges and things. The engineers down south of Iraq. I went down to meet them and thank them. And we actually encouraged the Japanese to play that role and to come, their engineers to do it. But because under their constitution, they couldn't take their own self-defence, although I thought they looked as if they could look after themselves. But anyway, we went down there for that purpose, and we carried out that purpose very effectively. But I thought that was a good thing at the time, because it was an attempt to try and help Iraq get past the conflict phase into a more, prospective environment, prospective phase. But it just never was enough.
Never enough. Did you ever sort of form misgivings about the overall wisdom of what Australia was doing in this coalition operation, either in Iraq or Afghanistan?
I had no misgivings in the early stages in either. Not just Australia. I sometimes wonder whether we stayed too long in either or both, and we being the coalition. But it's very hard to withdraw. Just hard to turn your back on violence and suffering, and so you take out the strong man and you remove one threat, but it tends to get replaced by others.
Yes. Robert, at the same time as this was going on, we had actually gone back into East Timor for the second time after the initial stabilisation operation. There was a period of instability in Timor, which saw the Australian forces need to deploy back again. So we were very heavily committed. Large deployment in our own nearer region, large operation in the Middle East. What's your memories of the Timor operation and how that fitted into a sort of a concept of Australia's strategic interests?
Well, when I became minister, we were still in Timor, and we were sort of at that phase. We were winding down, and overall, I think that was a very successful military operation, and Australia can be very proud of it, and very proud of the role that Defence Force played. And again, you sort of look at how that played out as against some of these other missions, and part of it is a totally different environment and a mission that is more clearly defined, but still a risky and challenging mission. So the decision to go into East Timor, I was in the cabinet that made that decision, but that was before I became Defence Minister. So my role as Minister with Timor was almost thanking people for what they'd done and sort of working a bit around the edges to reinforce the environment that we'd helped create it in Timor. Then these things don't ever leave you. Then at a later time in my life, I was Australian Ambassador to the UN. This is after I ceased to be Defence Minister. And at that time, there was the assassination attempt on Ramos Horta, and we sent troops back in. On that occasion, I was going to the Secretary General saying, "I just want to let you know this is what we're going to do and why we're going to do it." And we did that very well too.
Yes.
So that operation was pretty straightforward. The other one we had at the same time was Ramsey, the Solomons. And that was the Solomons. It was in a downward spiral in terms of stability, and it couldn't cope with that internally, and we basically put together the regional force and went into the Solomons and took control, and that was certainly at the time I was there was overwhelmingly successful too. Another instance that maybe the military stayed a bit too long. There's something for politicians to remember. There's always a temptation to get the military to do a job because they are can-do people, but sometimes there's some other instrument of government that is more appropriate. So when is the right time to get the military out and put the police in, and so forth. But Ramsay was very successful in many ways. It was successful the way we took up the responsibility. It was successful in its execution. It was successful in the way that we mobilised other South Pacific states, so that it just wasn't an Australian operation. It was a regional solution. I take my hats off to everyone who's involved in that operation. It was very successful.
Can you talk a little bit about the operation of the National Security Committee of Cabinet over these various operations? Because the NSC had quite effectively turned itself into a crisis management mechanism and seemed to perform the task quite well. What was your sort of memories of how that operated as a structure?
So it was meeting almost regularly. I was going to say continuously, because of this. I went from one operation to another operation. Someone told me once, I don't know if it's true, that in my 4 years as Defence Minister, we actually had more distinct operations than any other time in the nation's history.
It's very believable, I think. Yeah.
So, and John Howard, of course, was a stickler for process, so none of these decisions were taken without a thorough evaluation through the National Security Committee of Cabinet, including briefings from all the senior security personnel on every issue, and as the operations evolved, on the evolving operations. So it was a thorough process and a demanding process, but it was done very properly, and I think gave Cabinet confidence that the underlying work had been done to justify the actions that were being taken.
Through the 2000 White Paper and then the Iraq, the Afghanistan and Iraq and Timor experiences, John Howard had really turned himself into a national security Prime Minister. What did that mean for your relationship with him as a Defence Minister? It's often been said that Howard was his own Defence Minister in some ways.
Oh, right. So, yeah, they used some of the journos said, he called me in one article the Deputy Defence Minister. But you might remember that Menzies actually made himself the Defence Minister. But Prime Ministers are all different. John Howard is very much was very much a hands-on Prime Minister, and these were the big issues of the day, and they were big issues for the nation as a whole, and he wanted to have his fingerprints on all of them. So I had no problem with that. I understood that. I was in his leadership groups. I met with him every day. We talked about what was going on, what might go on, what we should be doing. It was a good working relationship. Mm.
Let me turn to some of the equipment issues. You've mentioned the challenges of managing procurement, the many folders that would pass across your desk. What's the sort of high points and low points for you when it came to the procurement area? I recall my own minister that I was Chief of Staff for, Ian McLaughlin. One of his early decisions was on Sea Sprite, which I think was a problem that lasted for most of your time as Defence Minister. So how did you approach the procurement story?
Sea Sprite, yeah. It was a second-hand aircraft. Very capable helicopter, a very complicated helicopter, and the Navy were never keen on them. This was a lesson I learned too. If you buy something that the military don't want, then you'll probably end up with problems. Other nations were able to operate them effectively. New Zealand got them.
Yes,
but we always seemed to have issues. That was one of those where I got the brief like this. What are the issues? Can they be resolved? And for most of my time, I thought the issues could be resolved. But in the end, once I left, I think they got rid of the sea sprite. So there's a lesson in that. But another one of these briefs was the Bushmaster program. And the development of the Bushmaster was not going well. And money was pouring in and the product just wasn't coming out the other end. And I remember, I think about it being a minister is Prime Minister Morrison's a bit like this too. If you've got a political issue, you've got to make a decision on it. Can't just let the file continue to grow. So I was pretty close to saying, let's cut and run on the Bushmaster. And I remember Cosgrove, who was then CDF, said to me, he said, yeah, there's a good argument for that, but I just think we might need that capability. The capability was a transport vehicle that had heavy armour that would be well protected from a bomb underneath, for example. Anyway, as it happened, we stuck with the program. The vehicle came good, and the capability saved Australian lives in Iraq.
Many lives.
So yeah. It's very hard to get it right. But anyway, I decided very early on that the system wasn't as efficient and effective as it should be. So I brought in Malcolm Kinnaird, who's a highly respected engineer and businessman, just a coincidence, he came from Adelaide, to look at it all, and he advised a range of reforms to make the acquisition process more business-like. And then we brought Stephen Gumley, who was then heading up ASC, Australian Submarine Corporation, so he was operating that business, but he'd had previously he'd had his own defence business down in Tasmania. Brought him to run it to try and introduce a more business-like way of doing it. And we went into some pretty major acquisitions, you know, the air warfare destroyers, the big flat ships, the purchases of the C-17, the early stages of involvement with the Joint Strike Fighter, and so forth. And we were able to make decisions. We made a lot of decisions in a relatively short period of time. And I believed at the end of that we had a better process than we had at the beginning. As we all know, it's never ending.
Yes.
We're still going on it.
I wanted to talk particularly about the Collins-class submarines, because you sort of came into the story at a time when there was a really major critique of the Collins class. Had started a few years earlier. The dud subs, sounds like a rock band underwater, and the task fell to you to try to work out how could we get a better capability from the vessels that had already been built. Can you tell me a little bit about your approach to dealing with Collins?
So Collins wasn't just the brief was there too, but you could see and feel and hear the problems every day.
Yes.
Hear the problems was too noisy. But anyway, and on Collins I felt that I should get my hands dirty and actually get involved as well. With a relationship, if I might say, with respect with Cockham's was bad. We couldn't get the proper communications. So I went to the Swedish minister and said, you know, I can't deal with your Cockham's. And I won't repeat what she said at the time, seeing this is going public, but they had some difficulties with Cockham's as well. They weren't easy people to work with. And in the end, no matter what Cockham's said, I said, we've got to solve these problems, and I worked that through with Defence, and I said, who knows more about submarines than anybody else? And they said, well, the Americans. Of course, there's the nuclear submarines, but so we took a lot of those issues, outstanding issues, to the Americans and said, will you help us with this? And surprise, surprise, our alliance partner said, certainly. Mm-hmm. And we found, in fact, they had a great deal of very useful knowledge that they were prepared to share with us. So we started working on the submarines together with the Americans. At the same time, the combat system there'd been early mistakes with the combat system, but that had been largely fixed by the time I got there. There was just this range of other issues with the submarine. So it was still work in progress when I left, but they clearly evolved into the best conventional submarine of their type in the world, and they probably still are today.
Yes.
So there are a lot of lessons in that. One of the lessons ought to be a little more self-confidence in what we're able to contribute ourselves. Do you remember the first submarine came from Sweden? They said it had to be done in Sweden because only the Swedes knew how to weld the plates on.
Yep.
And we got the first submarine out and the welds were no good and had to take it all off and redo it in Australia.
Yeah.
So a lesson in that as well. But I think what I did learn from that whole process is you just can't let these things go. They are such an important capability. You just can't let it continue in an unsatisfactory way. You've got to find the solutions and implement the solutions, even if it means taking a step, to one side and moving forward rather than running into the same roadblocks. But it was an interesting experience. I have to say, just to be fair to the Swedes, well, it was a long and very odd story about how Kockums then went to the Germans and the Swedes got Kockums back.
Yeah.
But I think the company under Saab is a very different company to what it was in those days.
Yeah. Along with Kim Beazley, I think you and Kim are the two longest serving defence ministers that Australia's had from the sort of post-Tang reforms. What's the secret to being a defence minister of longevity? Because after your time, we've seen a lot of ministers get there and perhaps stay for 18 months or even less.
Or even less. It's. I find it strange and not very satisfactory because I think to do the job, you've really got to be there for a reasonable period of time. So, and I only left the portfolio because I decided to leave the Parliament. I'd been there just under 25 years, had a good run, and I thought it was time to give someone else a go. So otherwise I might have beaten Beazley. Beazley was about a year longer than me, I think. But I think the secret is it's really managing, being able to manage the issues as they come, try to predict them, apply what you're supposed to bring, which is a political nous to the issues, and bring the solutions to your problem. So it was I only had one really bad experience, and that was to do. There were lessons in that as well. That was, you might remember, the Abu Ghraib stories, we had Australian people embedded in the American operations, and the story was about the way in which they were running those detention centres. And we always have to be careful, not speaking disrespectfully about our partner, but Australia, has obligations under certain humanitarian conventions that the US doesn't. We have different standards, and that's why in Iraq, we had a different set of rules of engagement, which the Americans actually respected. And I was misled as to knowledge of a particular report. It wasn't hugely consequential, but anyway, I was told we didn't have this report, and we did have it. The only problem was I told the Prime Minister we didn't have it either, and he told the Parliament we didn't have it. But this was hugely embarrassing to the command, the chiefs as well, because this particular soldier didn't think he needed to tell the truth. So So anyway, the Prime Minister was not happy on the job that day, but he was prepared to move on, which some may not have been prepared so to do.
Was that your sort of low point, would you say, as Defence Minister, the worst experience of being in the job?
Yeah, because you shouldn't be treated like that.
Yes.
And as I said, it wasn't just me, it was extremely distressful to the chiefs as well, because this person was letting them down as well as the government. But anyway, we got through it.
And Robert, the high points, what do you look back with sort of greatest fondness from your time as Minister?
I think I contributed to improving the acquisition processes. It might sound a bit boring, but I think it was important. I think I gave a sense to the operational forces that the government really did appreciate what they were doing, tried to understand the stresses they went through and that their families would be going through, and we're not taking them for granted, that we actually were grateful for the contributions they were making and the risks that they were taking. I got quite a lot of sense of satisfaction out of some of the defence diplomacy that I was involved in. So I helped set up the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, which was bringing defence ministers of the region together for the first time. Never met before, but meeting before, they can share experiences and you build a certain sense of common purpose. I liked doing that sort of work and thought it was useful. There were plenty of highs when I look back on it.
Was defence the toughest job you did in politics?
I don't think it was any. I think environment was tougher.
Really?
Yeah.
Because environment was new, is the argument.
Oh,
right?
It was really, really tough. I have a little joke saying I switched from environment to defence because environment was too combative.
Well, Robert, finally, if you had advice to give to a person who was moving into the defence portfolio as Minister, what would your advice be?
Don't always believe the first account, for that's another that's a problem for the chiefs as well, because they get the same first account. I think it's to not try and be what you're not. We, as I said to you a while ago, we are the political layer. They are our skill sets. We're the interface between the forces and the people. We have a responsibility of governance. If we try to do more than that, we will end up in trouble. Except that it's a complex business and there's lots of strong personalities and they're pushing and pulling each other. Display a certain amount of calm and resolve. Beyond that, don't get drawn into those issues. Respect the forces. Respect the challenge of their profession, and make sure they understand that you respect it. I found them very easy people to work with. This is the difference with environment, because they know what they're about. They know what they need to do, and if you respect that and show you respect it, they will be very loyal to you and the interests that you're representing. So those sort of messages I give to my successors, most who've lasted a year or so.
Right. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Robert. Thank you. Is there anything, by the way, that I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about, or other issues that we should cover? Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us.
There could be 1,000, but it doesn't matter.
No, it's been a great conversation. Thank you so much.